It's a very, very tough time, and my heart goes out to the family who have lost their loved ones in custody, and that's where my mind is at the moment. How are they going to heal from these challenges, and how are we going to move forward into the future and put safeguards in place that if any of our people end up in custody, they don't lose their life in that.
You experienced at a young age what prison was like. Was there support for you at all?
No, there was no support for me at all. The main job when me entering the institution was then to facilitate my behaviour and make sure I'm complying with the centre rules whilst being in there. I entered the criminal justice system and institutions at 14. And in that short 14 years, I lost both of my parents. I was taken from my two older siblings, and I grew up in a community where there was a lot of drugs and violence, and I didn't really understand how, being a double orphan at that age is going to impact me into my adulthood. And, my early childhood trauma wasn't acknowledged. It was more about, crime and punishment, that I'm being accused of a certain type of crime and how much time should I serve for that.
Is there a misunderstanding then of how people who have very sad, troubled backgrounds like you did through no fault of your own, about how you actually emotionally and mentally deal with that?
Yes, it was very, very, very misunderstood, and they are very under-resourced in targeting and treating our most vulnerable children in institutions and our vulnerable members, that they don't acknowledge childhood trauma or PTSD in terms of growing up in a violent community, a violent household, dysfunctional family members. None of that gets acknowledged or treated in these institutions. It's more around criminogenic behaviour and, your offence and what type of offence you committed. So there is a lack of support for, mental health services and specific interventions for early childhood trauma.
I want to talk about what you do now, which is amazing, but how did you turn it around?
Man, I had an epiphany one day when I was in custody, and that for me was, as a little child growing up in a poor community without my parents, I'd never dreamed that I would be, a struggling heroin addict, homeless, and be in and out of prison all my life. And that's not the life that I wanted, and that's not the quality of life that I wanted. So I took matters into my own hands to heal from my childhood trauma and to find ways to give back to my community and get people to understand how much our communities impact our decision making.
And you're doing that now. You're sitting in the car because you've just been into the Dondale Detention Centre. Do you despair when you walk in there and you see Indigenous kids and young adults in there?
Yeah, I'm still processing it at the moment, and to see the conditions that these young people are housed in and the lack of support that they have whilst being incarcerated, and also being so far removed from their family and their community and their support. That in itself loses your identity and your connection with your family. So when you're released now, you don't even feel like you fit in at home.
What sort of access do the authorities give you, Keenan? Are you encouraged to go in and talk to them?
Yes. So I got somebody who works in the centre reached out to me, and he's actually in the car with me, and it was a privilege that he reached out to me and let me go in there and have a yarn to some of the young boys and see how the centre is operating and what they have on offer for our most vulnerable young Aboriginal children.
When you hear that still more young Indigenous people are dying in custody all the time, and there's no one fix, obviously, but what would you like to see happen inside these institutions that would help stop that?
Well, I think for me and Deadly Connections and what we fight for is, one of the biggest recommendations out of the Royal Commission was that imprisonment would be the last resort for Aboriginal people, and there are no services or programs put in place. So when we enter the criminal justice system, that's the first point for Aboriginal people. We get arrested at higher rates, we get remanded at higher rates, therefore we are imprisoned at higher rates and have higher rates of deaths in prison.
Does it start? I mean, it must start with the community, but then the next step is the interactions that Aboriginal people are having with the police force, with the authorities. I mean, how can that be changed?
I think the biggest thing that I've been learning in terms of having these conversations on these platforms is, we're only one side of the problem. When are the police going to come to the table and sit down and learn from, the challenges that they've had and the mistakes they've made, and how can they improve it? Most recently, I acknowledge that it's 30 years since the Royal Commission, but it's also been 17 years since the police chased TJ Hickey in Redfern and he got impaled on a fence, and the coronial inquest was, a schmozzle, and police officers refused to testify, and we still have no justice for TJ, and TJ's mother has to live with this every day. And we had a memorial service for him, and the police didn't even come down and acknowledge the impact that that's had on, his family, his mum, and our community. They sent down, sort of the police to monitor our gathering and make sure that we're complying with, the rules of a peaceful protest and a march. That was the perfect time for the police to mend the relationship with Aboriginal community, particularly the Redfern community, and say, we don't always get it right. We're here, we hear you, we're listening, and we're here to work towards having nobody die in custody.